The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. On the Sabbath day, Jesus had gone for a meal to the house of one of the leading Pharisees, and they watched him closely. He then told the guests a parable, because he had noticed how they picked the places of honor. He said this: when someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take your seat in the place of honor. A more distinguished person than you may have been invited, and the person who invited you both may come and say, "Give up your place to this man." And then, to your embarrassment, you would have to go and take the lowest place. No, when you are a guest, make your way to the lowest place and sit there, so that when your host comes, he may say, "My friend, move up higher." In that way, everyone with you at the table will see you honored. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and the man who humbles himself will be exalted. Then he said to his host, when you give a lunch or a dinner, do not ask your friends, brothers, relations, or rich neighbors, for fear they repay your courtesy by inviting you in return. No, when you have a party, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. That they cannot pay you back means that you are fortunate, because repayment will be made to you when the virtuous rise again. The Gospel of the Lord.
The parable that we've just heard in today's Gospel is both very familiar and in many ways very uncomfortable. Perhaps it's why we now have seating plans at weddings and large dinners and so on. It solves all this sort of problem. It's a very odd parable in some ways, however, because it seems that Christ is promoting what we might call calculated seating, a method of thinking that would ensure that everyone sees you being promoted, and so your humility, or apparent humility, is really a form of pride. Deliberately sit in the wrong place, a low place of course, so that everyone will see you being exalted and think, "Oh, what a great person that is, that he's being moved up the table." But of course, that cannot be the message of this parable. That wouldn't fit in with the rest of the Gospel. The parable is about knowing your place. It's about knowing your value. But let's be clear, it's not about denying anyone the possibility of social mobility. Do you remember the hymn that we used to sing in primary school, "All Things Bright and Beautiful"? And that verse that isn't sung anymore: "The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high and lowly and gave them their estate." That is not what this parable, or indeed Christianity, is about. This parable is about humility. And let's be clear, humility is not about being a doormat. Humility is not about letting everyone just walk all over you. Humility is actually about honesty. If Ed Sheeran or someone in a similar position were to say that he's just a moderately successful singer, one or two people seem to like his stuff, and he's earned a bit of money from it, he wouldn't so much be being humble as a liar. For those who don't know, Ed Sheeran is actually a very successful singer today. To be humble, in his case, would be to acknowledge that he does have gifts, that he is successful, and that this is a result of the gifts and the blessings that God has given to him. The longest chapter in the Rule of St. Benedict is on humility. And St. Benedict is clear, as is Christ in this parable, that humility is the way to God. Humility is the way to heaven. And humility really means keeping your feet firmly on the ground, knowing not only our weaknesses, but also our strengths. And actually that, in many ways, is the easy bit, because that's internal. It's about me thinking and knowing myself. I say easy, relatively easy compared to other things. But the more difficult part is the generosity that Christ teaches at the end of today's Gospel reading. God blesses us. He may even bless us with material prosperity. But he does this not just for our own sake, but for the sake of others, so that we can bring God's generosity to those who are less fortunate than we are. And the first reading we had from the book of Ecclesiasticus, written in the 2nd century BC, gives us ideas about how to do this, because it's full of practical wisdom, telling us how we might live in the world, both the world then and now, and how to be truly humble. In the first reading, this is defined as gentleness, a word which means not just humility, but courtesy. Humility, as also courtesy, is pleasing to God, we're told. And of course the Bible and the tradition of the Church are full of examples of this. We have naturally Christ himself, Our Lady, St. Peter in his good moments, the tax collector praying in the temple, and so on. And this humility is pleasing to God, not because the person is making himself into a doormat, but because the humble person is aware of his need of God. The humble person knows that no matter how much material wealth he might have, without God and without God's blessing, he is absolutely nothing. It's easy to say that, of course, but how do we reach that level of humility? The heart of a sensible man will reflect on parables. An attentive ear is the sage's dream, we're told by Jesus ben Sirach in Ecclesiasticus. Reflection, prayer. Because prayer is the way in which we communicate with God. Prayer is the way in which we acknowledge our position in relation to God. It is the way in which we come to God, both alone and together, especially, of course, at Mass. It is in prayer that we experience, in small drops, the taste of the heavenly Jerusalem. And that heavenly Jerusalem, as we've heard, will be splendid beyond anything that we can possibly imagine. But it is not seen necessarily in those physical manifestations of God that we read of in Exodus and other parts of the Old Testament. The letter to the Hebrews told us there will be no fire, there won't be total darkness or some great voice. For most of us, it's much more subtle than this. It's more like the small voice experienced by Elijah on Mount Horeb. And so often, of course, that is what we experience in our prayer. Not huge, great manifestations of God. It'd be great to have some sometimes, so it must be said. But we get these small, tiny, sometimes barely discernible glimpses of the God that we love and serve. Small glimpses of heaven, glimpses of that place where everyone is truly humble and therefore truly equal in the presence of God, because everyone is truly valued by God. So perhaps the most important verse in today's readings might be that one that came at the end of the first reading. The heart of the sensible man will reflect on parables. An attentive ear is the sage's dream.